I was standing there on my front porch, the oppressive humidity of a mid-July morning in Cary, North Carolina, already clinging to my skin, holding a piece of certified mail that felt less like a standard correspondence and vastly more like a targeted drone strike on my hard-earned peace of mind. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind of heavy, arrogant stationery that instantly tells you the sender thinks they are royalty, bearing the embossed, gold foil insignia of the Willow Creek Property Owners Council, an organization that collected exorbitant monthly dues ostensibly to maintain the neighborhood, but practically functioned as a shadow government for retirees with a superiority complex. I hadn't even broken the seal yet, my half-finished mug of dark roast coffee growing lukewarm in my other hand, but I could already hear the rushing of my own blood in my ears, that heavy, thudding bass drop of sheer, unadulterated anxiety that hits you when you realize your private haven is about to be invaded. I tore it open with my teeth, frankly too agitated to set my mug down on the railing, and pulled out a letter signed in an icy, aggressive cursive by Evelyn Vance, the chairwoman of the board, a woman whose entire existence seemed predicated on making the lives of her neighbors utterly miserable. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate jargon, informing me, Elias Thorne, a remote cybersecurity analyst who rarely left the house and bothered absolutely no one, that the board had unilaterally decided my property at 714 Sycamore Trace harbored a severe, invisible threat to the neighborhood's geotechnical soil stability and subterranean aqueduct preservation. I literally had to read that sentence 3 times, my eyes narrowing at the sheer audacity of the claim, considering my backyard was a perfectly flat, immaculately dry patch of Bermuda grass that hadn't seen a puddle since a hurricane blew through 3 years ago. Yet here was this letter demanding immediate, unobstructed, and ongoing access to my private property. They were mandating, under threat of a staggering $200 daily fine and crippling legal liens, that I permanently remove the heavy-duty padlock from my 6-foot cedar privacy fence, leaving the gate wide open from dawn until dusk, every single weekday, just so their unauthorized, amateur inspectors could wander onto my land whenever they felt the whim. I slowly lowered the paper, staring out at the sickeningly perfect, manicured street of the Whispering Pines subdivision, realizing that the peaceful suburban dream I had bled myself dry to purchase was a complete and utter lie, a gilded cage governed by petty tyrants. I didn't buy this house for the crown molding, the stainless steel appliances, or the proximity to the Research Triangle Park. I bought it for exactly one desperately needed reason: that glorious, impenetrable, 6-foot wooden fortress enclosing my backyard, the only place in the world where I could disconnect from the suffocating stress of staring at hostile code all day. A sanctuary where I could sit by my pool in absolute silence, completely unseen and unbothered by the crushing demands of human interaction. And now, looking down the street toward Evelyn Vance's terrifyingly symmetrical, aggressively landscaped colonial home, I saw her standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed over a pastel cardigan that belonged in a museum of 1990s country club fashion, watching me with the predatory gaze of a hawk that had just spotted a wounded rabbit. She marched over, her sensible orthopedic walking shoes clicking against the pavement with the rhythm of an advancing infantry. And before she even crossed my property line, she began loudly lecturing me about invisible moisture levels, scoffing when I pointed out the blatant fact that our neighborhood hadn't seen rain in a month and that my deed explicitly showed the utility easement was entirely in the front yard, nowhere near my private sanctuary behind the house. She puffed out her chest, her beady eyes magnified behind thick lenses, and confidently cited a buried, archaic clause in the covenants about emergency blight prevention, threatening me with financial ruin, smiling that chilling, dead-eyed smile of someone who genuinely enjoys wielding tiny amounts of power to crush people, telling me the lock comes off by Monday morning or I would essentially be driven out of the neighborhood, bankrupt and broken. I retreated inside, slamming the solid oak front door so hard the framed photos in the hallway rattled, pouring my cold coffee straight down the kitchen sink and gripping the edge of the granite countertop, feeling a blinding, suffocating rage simmering in my chest, realizing that fighting a heavily funded board of bored millionaires in a traditional courtroom would bleed my savings dry long before a judge ever heard the case. I needed a tactical loophole, a flawless, legally binding trump card. So I immediately dialed my oldest college friend, Marcus, a ruthless corporate litigator who thrived on weaponizing fine print. And as I paced the hardwood floors, pouring out the chaotic details of Evelyn's extortionate demands, he laughed a dark, cynical laugh, explaining that while the covenants did grant them theoretical access, it didn't protect them from the legal liability of entering a designated hazardous zone. He explained, his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background, that if a homeowner establishes a legitimate, documented biological security measure, completely distinct from a domestic pet, and clearly posts liability waivers, anyone foolish enough to cross that threshold without a municipal warrant effectively surrenders their right to sue for bodily harm, suggesting, with a stroke of chaotic genius, that I bypass the homeowners association entirely and look into the specific agricultural zoning laws of Cary, North Carolina. My heart hammering against my ribs, I frantically pulled up the city's municipal code database, scrolling through endless PDFs of zoning ordinances until I found the golden ticket. Ordinance 72C of the Agricultural Preservation Act, clearly stating that residents in my specific residential tier were legally permitted to keep up to 8 heads of non-roosting waterfowl for organic pest management, provided they were enclosed by a fence. I cross-referenced this with the Homeowners Association bylaws, frantically hitting the search function for words like livestock, farm, and fowl, finding absolutely nothing, completely, utterly blank, because the snooty founders of Whispering Pines were so overly concerned with banning commercial vehicles and specific shades of exterior paint that they completely forgot to ban farm animals, assuming no one in a luxury subdivision would ever dare turn their property into an active combat zone guarded by prehistoric, feathered raptors. I grabbed my keys, a manic, slightly unhinged grin spreading across my face, fueled by the intoxicating promise of perfectly legal, deeply traumatizing revenge. I drove nearly an hour past the sprawling suburbs, deep into the rural, sun-baked backroads just outside of Raleigh, following the GPS to a dilapidated, rust-covered property called Broken Spoke Poultry Farm, where the smell of damp earth and aggressive livestock hit my senses before I even killed the engine of my SUV. I was met by Old Man Calloway, a heavily weathered farmer who looked at my pristine polo shirt and clean sneakers with profound, unvarnished pity, chuckling in a gravelly, cigarette-stained rasp when I told him I needed the meanest, most unhinged birds he had on the property, specifically clarifying that I wasn't looking for egg layers or pets, but rather a biological defense force capable of making a grown, overly confident woman question every life choice she had ever made. He led me to a reinforced pen in the back, spitting a stream of tobacco into the dirt, pointing to a terrifyingly muscular flock of African geese, warning me that these specific creatures possessed absolutely zero moral compass, highlighting a massive, dark-beaked alpha he affectionately referred to as a menace to society, a creature that had recently hospitalized a stray coyote and harbored a deep, personal hatred for anything that walked on 2 legs. I bought 6 of them on the spot, handing over the cash and spending the next 45 grueling, chaotic minutes helping the farmer wrestle these hissing, flapping, violently uncooperative demons into heavy-duty transport crates, securing the alpha, whom I immediately christened Ares, along with his chaotic lieutenants, Goliath, Banshee, Valkyrie, Havoc, and the smallest but undoubtedly most psychotic one, Doomsday. The drive back to 714 Sycamore Trace was an absolute nightmare of deafening honks, guttural hissing, and a smell that I feared would permanently embed itself into the upholstery. But my spirits remained soaringly high, pulling into my driveway just as Hector, a burly, heavily tattooed independent contractor I had hired at triple his emergency rate, was unboxing rolls of reinforced steel mesh and industrial-grade aluminum signage. As Hector bolted the heavy, blood-red warning signs reading, "Critical warning, aggressive biological security measures in effect. Enter at your own peril. No liability assumed for physical or psychological trauma," directly through the wood of my gate, so they couldn't be tampered with, he peered into the back of my car, turning slightly pale when he realized what was making that demonic noise, quickly finishing the reinforcement of the lower fence line and practically sprinting to his truck to escape the inevitable carnage. I waited until the neighborhood was dead quiet, carrying the heavy crates into the enclosed privacy of my backyard, standing safely elevated on my second-story deck, reaching down with a long broom handle to pop the latches, holding my breath as Aries strutted out into the lush green grass, stretching his massive wingspan, letting out a deafening, prehistoric scream that echoed off the surrounding houses, instantly claiming the territory as his sovereign kingdom. The rest of the flock emerged, immediately falling into a militaristic patrol formation, ruthlessly tearing at the grass, looking up at me on the deck with cold, calculating eyes, while I merely nodded down at them, removing the heavy padlock from my gate, leaving it secured only by a simple thumb latch, wide open to anyone foolish enough to ignore the glaring red signs, sending a polite, meticulously documented email to Evelyn Vance that her access was now fully uninhibited per her demand. Monday morning arrived with a suffocating, tense silence, my coffee brewing in the background as I sat glued to the feed of my high-definition security cameras, watching the digital clock tick closer to the dreaded inspection hour, my heart hammering against my ribs as I saw Evelyn, clutching a clipboard like a shield, marching down the side path of my house, trailed by a pale, terrified-looking young assistant named Julian, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on Earth. Through the audio feed, I heard Julian timidly point out the massive red warning signs, his voice trembling as he read the words, "aggressive biological security." But Evelyn, blinded by her own arrogance and an insatiable need to enforce her authority, aggressively dismissed it as a pathetic, empty bluff, shoving her clipboard into his chest and ordering him to lift the latch and breach the perimeter, completely unaware that she was walking blindly into an ambush. The gate swung inward, the heavy wood creaking in the morning air, and for a breathless, agonizing second, the yard appeared completely devoid of life, a beautiful, tranquil trap, right up until the moment Evelyn boldly stepped her orthopedic shoes onto the lawn, triggering an absolute explosion of chaos from the dense shrubbery bordering the pool. Aries didn't just attack. He launched a perfectly coordinated, terrifyingly fast ground assault, sprinting with his neck extended parallel to the earth, his massive wings beating the air like heavy sails, emitting a horrifying, demonic hiss, hitting her squarely in the shins with the force of a swinging sandbag, while Valkyrie and Havoc masterfully flanked her from the sides, cutting off any hope of a tactical retreat. Julian, operating on pure, unadulterated survival instinct, shrieked in terror, immediately backing out of the yard and violently pulling the gate shut, leaving the chairwoman of the Willow Creek Property Owners Council completely trapped inside a hostile, locked arena with 6 furious, territorial apex predators, her screams piercing the quiet suburban morning as she scrambled, dropping her clipboard and blindly clambering onto the glass top of my patio table, pulling her knees to her chest, while the geese systematically surrounded her, honking in a rhythmic, terrifying chorus of total victory. I calmly stepped out onto my deck, sipping my coffee from behind the safety of my screen door, politely reminding the screaming, red-faced tyrant that she had been warned, watching in supreme satisfaction as the local police, specifically a weary veteran named Officer Reynolds, arrived nearly 15 minutes later to find the neighborhood's most feared woman held hostage on a piece of outdoor furniture by a flock of waterfowl. Reynolds, struggling valiantly to hide the massive grin spreading across his face after reading my meticulously placed warning signs and confirming the legality of my agricultural setup, calmly informed a dripping, hyperventilating Evelyn that since she had willfully ignored clear hazard warnings and entered a private enclosure uninvited, no crime had been committed by the homeowner, advising her to seek higher ground next time and effectively escorting the humiliated, defeated woman off my property as Aries watched them leave, standing proudly at the gate like a conquering king. The brief, fragile peace that followed the patio table incident lasted barely 48 hours before the retaliation began, not with a direct confrontation, but with a series of frantic, desperate administrative strikes, starting with a $500 violation notice aggressively taped to my front door, citing me for housing an unpermitted biological nuisance and erecting unauthorized defensive signage. A threat that my lawyer, Marcus, laughed off over a brief phone call, assuring me that municipal liability laws vastly overpowered whatever flimsy aesthetic guidelines the board tried to weaponize, advising me to keep the cameras rolling because cornered tyrants always predictably escalate. True to his word, Evelyn, realizing she could no longer physically breach the property herself or weaponize the local police department against me, resorted to hiring mercenaries, sending a white van from Apex Terrascaping, a brutal, commercial lawn care crew contracted by the neighborhood, ordering them to forcefully enter my backyard under the guise of an emergency weed abatement procedure, completely failing to mention to these poor, unsuspecting workers what exactly was waiting for them. Behind the wooden fence, I watched through the security monitors with a mix of awe and pity as three massive, burly men armed with heavy-duty gas-powered weed whackers and leaf blowers unlatched the gate, confidently striding into the yard, only to be instantly, violently swarmed by the entire flock in a synchronized, unmerciful counterattack. It was an absolute ballet of chaos. You simply cannot fight an airborne, 50-pound ball of pure rage with a plastic weed trimmer, and within 45 agonizing seconds, the heavily armed landscaping crew was completely routed, dropping their expensive equipment in the grass. One massive guy actually vaulting my 6-foot cedar fence with the desperate agility of an Olympic hurdler, while the lead foreman scrambled back to his van, violently cursing the neighborhood, screaming that he didn't care how much the board was paying them. They were never, ever stepping foot near that demonic gateway again, just to prove that my feathered guardians weren't mindless, bloodthirsty monsters. When Benny, my loyal, independent HVAC technician, arrived the next day to fix a loud hum in my air conditioning unit, I simply handed him a large Ziploc bag of frozen peas, instructing him to toss them as a toll to the guardians, watching safely from the window as the geese happily devoured the peace offering, completely ignoring Benny as he calmly worked, proving once and for all that these beautiful creatures had an impeccable, innate sense for distinguishing between honest working men and invasive, arrogant threats. The ultimate, final boss battle commenced on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, signaled by an aggressively sustained ringing of my doorbell, revealing Evelyn Vance standing on my porch with an unsettling, victorious smirk, flanked this time by a heavily perspiring city code enforcer named Inspector Hayes and a deeply bored-looking commercial locksmith, smugly presenting me with an emergency municipal warrant claiming my property harbored a critical sanitation biohazard that demanded immediate, state-sanctioned entry. I leaned casually against the doorframe, clearly and loudly stating from my own recording device that I was opening the gate strictly under legal duress, aggressively reiterating that the yard was actively guarded by extremely territorial, legally zoned agricultural livestock that did not recognize or respect municipal authority, a warning that Evelyn aggressively dismissed, stepping behind the bulky inspector and using him as a human shield as he arrogantly unlatched the gate and stepped onto the grass. They didn't even make it halfway to the shed before the trap snapped shut, a brilliant, pincer movement ambush where Ares and Goliath charged from the deep shadows of the brush, while Doomsday and the rest of the flock cut off their retreat from under the low clearance of the deck, honking with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Inspector Hayes panicked, stumbling backward and completely wiping out over a small divot in the lawn, leaving a wildly shrieking Evelyn exposed and unprotected, desperately turning to sprint for the exit. But the geese relentlessly pressed the attack, forcing her off the grass, her sensible shoes slipping disastrously on the slick, wet concrete surrounding the deep end of my pool, resulting in a glorious, slow-motion, majestic splash that sent a geyser of chlorinated water high into the summer air. She surfaced, sputtering, coughing, her meticulously styled hair plastered flat against her skull, her expensive cardigan ruined, completely defeated and humiliated as the flock paced the edge of the water, honking in absolute, undeniable triumph, prompting Inspector Hayes to quickly brush the dirt off his uniform, cancel the inspection due to a hostile environment, and briskly walk away, leaving me to casually extend a pool skimmer pole to fish the weeping, broken tyrant out of my water, watching her slink back down the street without saying a single word. The aftermath was a swift, beautiful cascade of justice. The video of the pool incident never leaked, but the legend of the backyard ambush spread like absolute wildfire through the terrified neighborhood, leading to a massive emergency council meeting where the residents, sick of her overbearing tyranny, overwhelmingly voted to depose Evelyn Vance from her throne, replacing her with a laid-back neighbor who immediately told me to keep the birds as long as I kept the gate locked. I eventually sold that house for a massive profit to a young couple who thought the heavy-duty warning signs were a hilarious, quirky feature, taking my heavily decorated veterans, my feathered brothers in arms, with me to a sprawling, 10-acre property out in the absolute middle of nowhere, where there were no busybodies, no arbitrary rules, and absolutely no neighbors to disturb our hard-won peace. Sitting here now on my massive wraparound porch, watching Aries aggressively chase a confused deer away from the tree line, I can't help but look back at the chaos and wonder. When the structures meant to protect our communities are weaponized by the petty and the power-hungry to invade our most sacred, private spaces, is it truly a breach of morality to unleash a little bit of primal, chaotic nature to take our sanctuaries back? Or is it simply the purest form of justice?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.